The sun was a weight on my shoulders, a familiar pressure that had settled into my bones over 10 years of this work. Up here, alone with the sky and the worn slate of St. Jude's steeple, the heat was clean. It baked the scent of tar and old timber out of the roof, a smell I knew better than any other. My world was reduced to the 3-foot radius around my hands. The scrape of my trowel against mortar, the precise tap of the hammer, the satisfying click of a new tile setting into its century-old bed. It was a small, manageable world, and I had built it that way on purpose. Down below, the town of Havenwood went about its business. Cars moved like patient beetles along Main Street, and the murmur of life was a distant, irrelevant hum. I preferred the distance. It kept things simple. My life was a series of contracts, each one a self-contained problem to be solved with my hands and my head. Finish the job, get paid, move on to the next. Loneliness was just a cost of doing business, a trade-off for the quiet order I craved. My beat-up Ford truck, my rented room over the hardware store, the ache in my lower back at the end of the day, these were the constants. They were mine. This job was different, though. The church roof was a local legend, a patchwork of failed repairs and stubborn leaks that had defeated better-funded contractors than me. I took it because the parish council was desperate, and because I was, in my own quiet way, just as desperate. My last job had fallen through, and the space between paying gigs had stretched from a comfortable week to a worrying month. So I'd lowballed my bid, promising to use salvage slate where I could to keep costs down, and they'd accepted with a kind of weary gratitude. The real difference, however, wasn't the crumbling Gothic architecture or the shoestring budget. It was him, Arthur Vance. He was the reason the project was happening at all, the silent benefactor whose donation was covering my fee and materials. I knew of him, of course. Everyone in Havenwood knew of the Vance family and their sprawling cattle ranch that bordered the west side of town. He was a local institution, a man who moved with a quiet gravity. His presence felt more than it was seen. I'd see his dark green pickup truck parked outside the diner sometimes, or catch a glimpse of him at the feed store, always polite, always reserved. He was older than me by a good 20 years, his hair more salt than pepper, his face carved with lines that spoke of sun and thought, not of stress. I had a saved image on my phone, a screenshot from the local paper's article about his donation. It was a formal picture, him standing beside the smiling pastor, but his eyes weren't looking at the camera. They were looking slightly away, thoughtful and maybe a little sad. I told myself I kept it for reference, to put a face to the man paying my bills. It was a lie, of course. I kept it because looking at it felt like standing in the shade on a hot day. It was a quiet, unexamined comfort. So when I heard the crunch of gravel below and saw that same dark green truck pull into the church's small lot, a strange, unfamiliar jolt went through me. It wasn't anxiety, not exactly. It was anticipation, a tightening in my chest. He got out, moving with an unhurried grace that seemed at odds with his solid frame. He didn't look up at me right away. Instead, he walked the perimeter of the church, his hands in the pockets of his worn jeans, his gaze tracing the lines of the old stone walls up to the roof where I worked. He was assessing, taking it all in. I stopped my work, my hammer resting on my thigh. The sun beat down, and a bead of sweat traced a path from my temple down my jaw. I watched him watch the church. He had a stillness about him, a rootedness that made me feel, for a moment, like a loose shingle in a high wind. He finally tilted his head back, his eyes finding me against the blue canvas of the sky. He didn't wave or shout a greeting. He just looked. His expression was unreadable from this distance, but I felt the weight of his gaze as surely as I felt the sun on my skin. It wasn't a look of judgment or oversight. It was one of quiet, steady consideration. After a long moment, he gave a slow, single nod. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, nothing more, but it felt like a conversation. He then turned and got back into his truck, the engine a low rumble that faded as he drove away. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, my heart thudding against my ribs. The silence he left behind felt different, heavier. My small, manageable world had just been visited by something large and undefined, and I knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and thrilling, that nothing was going to be simple for a while. He started coming by every day after that. Around 3 o'clock, when the afternoon heat was at its most punishing, his truck would appear. He never stayed long. He'd bring a bottle of ice-cold water or a thermos of sweet tea, leaving it on the tailgate of his truck for me. The first time, he'd called up, his voice a low, calm baritone that carried easily in the still air. "Left you something on the truck, Leo." He'd used my name. I hadn't realized he even knew it. I'd mumbled a thank you, my voice hoarse, feeling clumsy and exposed under his patient gaze. I'd climb down, muscles protesting, and find the condensation-beaded bottle waiting for me. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like more. It felt like care. No one had taken care of me in a long time. I'd lean against the warm metal of his truck, drinking the cold water so fast it made my teeth ache, and watch him inspect the day's progress from a respectful distance. He never offered advice or criticism. He just looked, his eyes sharp and intelligent, missing nothing. He'd ask a question or two, always about the work. "How's that flashing holding up around the chimney?" Or, "Think you'll have this section done before the rain on Friday?" His questions weren't idle chatter. They were precise. He understood the work, the challenges of it. I found myself explaining the intricacies of setting slate on a curved turret, the way I had to custom cut each piece to fit the building's sag and sway. He listened, really listened, his head tilted slightly, his focus entirely on me. In those moments, the 20 years and the immeasurable gulf of wealth between us seemed to shrink. We were just two men talking about a job that needed doing right. I started to look forward to his visits, the way you look forward to a break in the clouds. His presence broke the monotony of the long, solitary hours. I found myself working with a renewed focus, a desire to impress him with my craftsmanship. I wanted him to see the clean lines, the solid seams, the care I put into every single tile. It was a foolish, boyish impulse, but I couldn't shake it. I wanted his approval, that slow nod that said, "Good work." I began to study him, to catalog the small details. The way his knuckles were scarred and calloused, proof that his wealth hadn't been inherited from a desk. The fine lines that fanned out from the corners of his eyes, etched there by years of squinting into the sun. The low, steady timbre of his voice, a sound that seemed to settle something deep inside me. He was a man who was comfortable in his own skin, who took up space in the world without apology, but also without arrogance. He was a foundation. I was a man who spent his days on shifting surfaces, always mindful of the long drop below. One afternoon, the heat was particularly brutal. The air was thick and heavy, and the sun felt like a physical blow. I was dehydrated and clumsy, and I dropped my hammer. It slid down the steep pitch of the roof, bounced off the gutter with a loud clang, and landed in the overgrown bushes below. I swore under my breath, my head pounding. I started the slow, careful climb down the ladder, feeling every bit of my frustration and fatigue. Arthur was already there. He had retrieved the hammer from the bushes and was standing at the base of the ladder, waiting for me. He held it out, handle first. "Happens," he said, his voice even. His eyes, a deep hazel that seemed to hold the color of the earth and the sky, were filled with a concern that went beyond a dropped tool. I took the hammer, our fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. A jolt, small and sharp as static electricity, shot up my arm. His skin was warm and dry. My hand was slick with sweat. I pulled back as if burned, my face flushing. "Thanks," I mumbled, avoiding his gaze. "You look like you're about done in," he said, his voice gentle. "Why don't you call it a day?" "The heat's not letting up. Got to finish this section," I said, my pride stinging. "Can't afford to fall behind." He was silent for a moment. I could feel him studying me, and the weight of his attention was intense. It made me want to squirm, to climb back up the ladder and hide on the roof where I belonged. "There's falling behind, and there's falling off," he said softly. "The church has waited 100 years for a new roof. It can wait until tomorrow morning." His words were not a command, but they carried an undeniable authority. He was right, of course. I was pushing myself too hard, courting a stupid accident. But hearing it from him, seeing the genuine worry in his eyes, made something inside me ache. It was the ache of a locked door being tested, a hinge groaning in protest. I was so used to being the only one who cared about my well-being. I finally met his eyes. "Yeah," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Okay." He gave that slow nod again, but this time, a small smile touched the corners of his mouth. It transformed his face, easing the stern lines. "Good," he said. "Go home, Leo. Get some rest." He stayed until I had packed up my tools and secured the tarps for the night. He didn't help, just stood by his truck, a silent, solid presence that felt strangely protective. As I got into my own truck, the engine catching with a familiar cough and sputter, he was still there, watching. I drove away with the feeling of his gaze on my back, the brief touch of his hand still tingling on my skin. That night, sleep didn't come easily. My small, ordered world was beginning to feel very complicated indeed. The quiet foundation was settling, and I was terrified the ground beneath my feet was about to give way. The promised rain arrived on Friday, not as a gentle shower, but as a full-blown thunderstorm. It rolled in from the west, the sky turning a bruised purple-gray. I'd managed to finish the section I was worried about, getting the last of the flashing sealed just as the first fat drops began to fall. I scrambled down the ladder, soaked and shivering, my mind on the materials I'd left staged in the churchyard. The new slate was stacked on pallets, covered with tarps, but the specialized cutting tools and the bags of mortar mix were more vulnerable. As I was wrestling with a flapping tarp, the wind trying to rip it from my grasp, Arthur's truck pulled in. He was out in an instant, moving with a purpose that startled me. He wore a heavy-duty rain slicker, the hood pulled up, but his face was set in grim lines. "Get in the truck," he shouted over the wind and the rising drumbeat of the rain. "My tools," I yelled back, gesturing to the clutter. "The mortar will be ruined." "We'll come back for it," he insisted, taking a step toward me. "This is turning nasty. My barn is 5 minutes from here. We can store everything there. It's dry." The offer was so practical, so sensible, that I couldn't argue. The alternative was watching $1,000 worth of material turn into a useless, hardened lump. I nodded, and together we worked quickly, loading the heavy saws and bags into the bed of his truck. He moved with a surprising strength and efficiency, lifting the 100-pound bags of mortar as if they were sacks of feed. We were shoulder to shoulder, our movements synchronized by the urgency of the task. The rain plastered my thin t-shirt to my skin, and I was acutely aware of his proximity, the solid warmth of his body next to mine. Finally, we threw my toolbox in on top of the rest and scrambled into the cab of his truck. The door slammed shut, cutting off the roar of the storm to a muted drumming on the roof. The silence inside was sudden and profound. I sat there, dripping onto his immaculate leather seats, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The air was filled with the scent of rain, wet earth, and something else, something that was just him. A clean, subtle scent of soap and leather and open air. He put the truck in gear and turned on the heater, the blast of warm air a shocking comfort against my cold skin. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low and steady in the confines of the cab. "Yeah, fine," I managed, pushing my wet hair off my forehead. "Thank you. You didn't have to do that. It's my investment, too," he said, his eyes on the rain-slicked road. "Got to protect it," but his tone suggested he was talking about more than just the bags of mortar. I looked at his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the focus in his eyes as he navigated the storm. I felt a sudden, powerful wave of gratitude that was so intense it almost felt like grief. It was the feeling of being seen, of being helped, without having to ask. His barn was immense, a cathedral of old wood and hay-scented air. He backed the truck right inside, and we unloaded everything into a dry corner. The storm raged outside, but in here, it was peaceful. The only sounds were the rain on the metal roof and the soft lowing of cattle in a distant section of the barn. We worked in a comfortable silence, stacking the materials neatly. It felt strangely domestic, this shared, simple task. When we were done, he disappeared for a moment and came back with 2 thick, clean towels. He handed one to me. "You're soaked through," he said, a statement of fact with no judgment in it. He started drying his own hair, his movements economical and sure. I hesitated, then scrubbed the towel over my head and face, the rough cotton a welcome friction against my cold skin. I pulled off my drenched t-shirt, wringing it out before using the towel on my chest and arms. I was suddenly, intensely aware of my own body, of the lean, wiry muscles defined by years of physical labor. I was also aware of him watching me. I risked a glance. His hands had stilled. He was looking at me, his gaze direct and unshielded. The air in the barn thickened, charged with an unspoken current. He cleared his throat, his eyes flicking away for a second before returning to mine. "I have some old work clothes up at the house," he said, his voice a little rougher than usual. You'll catch your death if you put that wet shirt back on. I opened my mouth to protest, to say I was fine, that I could just wait in the truck. But the words wouldn't come. The truth was, I didn't want to leave. I wanted to stay here, in this quiet, protected space with him. The thought was a revelation, a door swinging open in a part of my mind I'd kept locked for years. Okay, I said, the word coming out softer than I intended. He held my gaze for a moment longer, and in his eyes, I saw a reflection of my own turmoil, my own dawning realization. It was a look of shared vulnerability, a quiet acknowledgement that something significant was happening between us, here in the heart of the storm. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod and turned toward the massive barn doors, leading the way out into the rain and toward the house on the hill, toward a place I was starting to feel was much more than just a dry place to change my clothes. It felt like a destination. The ranch house was like the man who owned it, solid, understated, and built to last. It was made of stone and dark wood, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front. Inside, it was clean and masculine, smelling of wood smoke and old books. There were no frills, no unnecessary decorations, just comfortable leather furniture, shelves filled with books, and a few framed photographs on the mantel of a vast, empty landscape that I assumed was his property. It was the home of a man who lived a solitary, but not a lonely life. Arthur led me through a mudroom into a spacious kitchen. "Wait here," he said. "I'll go find you something." He disappeared up a wide staircase, his footsteps echoing softly in the quiet house. I stood awkwardly in the middle of the kitchen, feeling out of place. My bare feet were cold on the slate floor, and I wrapped the towel tighter around my shoulders. I was an intruder in this calm, ordered world. My own life felt messy and chaotic in comparison. He returned with a soft, faded flannel shirt and a pair of worn jeans. He laid them on the kitchen table. "They might be a little big," he said, "but they're dry, thank you." I said again, feeling my vocabulary had been reduced to just those two words. "I don't know where I can. Bathroom's just down the hall," he said, anticipating my question. "And don't worry about the wet clothes. I'll throw them in the dryer for you." The simple, practical offer was almost my undoing. It was an act of domestic intimacy that felt more significant than any touch. He was taking my wet, dirty clothes and making them clean and dry. He was, in a small way, taking care of me. I changed in the small, clean bathroom, the scent of his soap hanging in the air. The clothes were, as he'd predicted, a little big. The jeans were loose in the waist, and the sleeves of the flannel shirt were too long, but they were warm and soft against my skin. They smelled like him, that clean, outdoor scent. Wearing his clothes felt like a transgression, a claim I had no right to make. It also felt incredibly, dangerously good. When I came back to the kitchen, he had 2 mugs of coffee steaming on the table. He gestured for me to sit. The rain was still drumming against the windows, but inside, it was warm and safe. We sat in silence for a few minutes, sipping the coffee. It was strong and black, just how I liked it. He seemed to know that. "The storm's settling in for the night," he said finally, breaking the silence. "Road back to town might flood at the creek crossing. You're welcome to stay. There's a guest room." My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it, the moment where the path forked. I could make an excuse, thank him, and take my chances with the flooded creek. I could retreat to my small, safe world, where I was in control, where no one could get close enough to hurt me. Or I could stay. I could accept this quiet, unadorned invitation and see where this new, uncertain path led. The fear of that unknown was a cold knot in my stomach. But the fear of going back to my empty room, of lying awake listening to the rain and thinking about what I'd walked away from, was far worse. I looked at him across the table. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring into his coffee cup, his big, capable hands wrapped around the mug. He was giving me space, letting me make the decision without pressure. And in that moment, I understood something crucial about him. His strength wasn't in his wealth or his status in the town. It was in his restraint. It was in the quiet, steady way he offered safety without demanding anything in return. He was opening a door and simply waiting to see if I would walk through it. "I think I'd like that," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "If you're sure it's no trouble." He looked up, and the relief in his eyes was so clear, so profound, that it stole my breath. A slow smile spread across his face, the same one I'd seen at the base of the ladder. But this time it reached his eyes, crinkling the weathered skin at the corners. "It's no trouble at all, Leo," he said softly. "No trouble at all." The guest room was simple and spare, much like the rest of the house. It had a sturdy oak bed frame, a patchwork quilt, and a single window that looked out over the rain-swept fields. My clothes, now warm and dry from the dryer, were folded neatly on the chair. Arthur had brought them up while I was in the shower he'd offered. The hot water had washed away the day's grime and some of my fatigue, but my mind was racing. Lying in the strange bed, listening to the sounds of the old house settling around me, I felt a deep sense of unreality. Just this morning, I had been a roofer on a church, a man defined by his solitude and his skill. Now I was a guest in the home of the man who had occupied my thoughts for weeks, wearing his clothes, about to sleep under his roof. The speed of the change was dizzying. I thought about the gulf between us. He was an established man, a pillar of the community, rooted in this land for generations. I was a drifter, my roots shallow, my possessions few. What could a man like him possibly see in a man like me? The question circled in my mind, a vulture of doubt. Maybe he was just being kind. Maybe he was lonely and saw in me a project, someone to fix, like the church roof. The thought was a cold spike of fear. I was used to being self-sufficient. The idea of being a charity case was humiliating. But then I remembered the look in his eyes in the barn. It wasn't pity. It was something else, something raw and real. I remembered the way his hands had stilled as he watched me, the roughness in his voice when he offered me a dry shirt. These were not the actions of a man offering charity. They were the actions of a man who was, for his own reasons, just as uncertain and vulnerable as I was. He had boundaries, but they weren't walls. They were carefully drawn lines meant to ensure my comfort, to give me agency. He never presumed. He offered, "You're welcome to stay. There's a guest room." He was giving me control, letting me set the pace. It was a subtle but profound display of respect, a quiet acknowledgement of the potential power imbalance between us and a deliberate effort to level it. He was using his resources not to control me, but to create a space where I could feel safe. A soft knock on the door startled me from my thoughts. "Leo." Arthur's voice was low, just on the other side of the door. "Yeah." I sat up, my heart starting its familiar, frantic rhythm. "Just wanted to make sure you had everything you needed." There was a pause. "And to say goodnight, I'm fine." "Everything's great," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "Thank you. For everything, you're welcome." Another pause, longer this time. I could almost feel him standing there, his hand likely resting on the doorknob. I imagined him on the other side, his expression thoughtful, perhaps wrestling with his own doubts. The silence stretched, filled with all the things we weren't saying. Then, he spoke again, his voice even softer, almost a whisper. "I worry, you know." The admission was so unexpected, so direct, that it caught me completely off guard. "Worry? About what?" "About being seen as overbearing," he said, the words chosen with care. "About making you feel obligated because of the job, because of all this." He was voicing the very fears that had been circling in my own mind. He was laying his own vulnerability on the table, a quiet offering of trust. I am not good with words. My hands are my language. But in that moment, words were all I had. I get up, walk to the door, and open it. He is standing there, his hands still near the knob, just as I'd pictured. His expression is serious, his eyes searching mine. The hallway light behind him creates a soft halo, making the silver in his hair shine. "You don't," I say, and my voice is raw with an emotion I can't name. You make things feel steady." His shoulders seem to relax, a subtle easing of a tension I hadn't noticed he was carrying. A faint, sad smile touches his lips. "Steady is something I can do," he says. He looks down at my hands, which are clenched at my sides, then back up to my face. His gaze is intense, a quiet fire in the hazel depths. "Good night, Leo." "Good night, Arthur," I whisper. He lingers for a heartbeat longer, as if he wants to say more, to do more. But he doesn't. He just gives me a small, final nod and turns, his stockinged feet silent on the old wooden floor as he walks back to his own room. I close my door and lean against it, my forehead pressed to the cool wood. The air is thick with unspoken feelings, with the electric potential of what could be. The foundation is no longer just settling. It's solid. And for the first time in a very long time, I am not afraid to build something on it. I am ready to climb higher. The next morning, the world was washed clean. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of pale, cloudless blue and the fresh, earthy scent of rain-soaked soil. I woke early, feeling more rested than I had in months. The house was still and quiet. I dressed in my own dry clothes, which felt both familiar and strangely foreign after wearing his. I found Arthur in the kitchen, a mug of coffee already in his hand, staring out the window at the rising sun. He turned as I entered, and a slow, easy smile spread across his face. It was a smile of simple, uncomplicated welcome. "Morning," he said. "Coffee's fresh." "Morning," I replied, my voice still thick with sleep. "Thanks." We fell into an easy rhythm, making breakfast together. He cooked bacon and eggs while I made toast. We didn't talk much, but the silence was comfortable, companionable. It felt like a scene from a life I'd never allowed myself to imagine, a quiet domesticity that was both deeply comforting and utterly terrifying. This was how people lived, I thought. People who had homes, who had someone to share a morning with. After we ate, he looked at me across the table, his expression turning serious again. "About the church roof," he began. My stomach tightened. I expected him to say something about the delay, about the time lost to the storm. "I was up there yesterday, before the rain," he continued, "while you were packing up. I looked at that steeple." He paused, his gaze steady. "It's dangerous, Leo. That woodwork is more rotten than it looks from the ground. You're taking risks you don't need to take." "It's my job," I said, a defensive edge to my voice. "I know what I'm doing." "I know you do," he said calmly, not rising to my defensiveness. "You're the best craftsman I've seen in a long time." "That's not the point." He leaned forward slightly, his forearms resting on the table. "The point is, there are other ways to work. Safer ways. I can't afford a crew, if that's what you're suggesting," I said, the old bitterness of my financial situation creeping in. "I'm not," he said. He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words. "I have a proposition for you. When you're done with the church, I want to offer you a job. Here, on the ranch." The offer hung in the air between us. My first instinct was rejection. My pride, that stubborn, foolish thing, screamed that this was charity, a way to keep me close, to make me dependent. I felt the walls going up, the familiar retreat into self-sufficiency. But he must have seen the conflict on my face, because he kept talking, his voice low and reasonable, dismantling my defenses before I could even voice them. "This isn't a handout, Leo. It's a real job. The old foreman's cottage needs a complete restoration. The main barn needs structural work. There's a dozen projects I've been putting off because I can't find anyone with the right skills, with your attention to detail. I'd pay you a proper salary. You could live in the cottage once it's finished. It would be yours." He was offering me a foundation. A real one. A home. A steady paycheck. A future that didn't involve scrambling for the next contract, living hand to mouth. He was offering me a chance to put down roots. "Why?" I asked, the word a raw whisper. "Why are you doing this?" He held my gaze, and all the quiet restraint, all the careful boundaries he had maintained, seemed to fall away. His eyes were dark with an emotion that was deep and undeniable. "Because watching you on that roof every day, taking those risks alone, it's more than I can stand," he said, his voice thick. "Because I want you safe. And because," he took a breath, "I want you here." The confession was simple, direct, and utterly devastating. It was everything I had secretly, desperately hoped to hear, and it terrified me. To accept his offer was to accept everything that came with it. It was to step off the precarious ledge I'd lived on for so long and trust that he would be there to catch me. I am standing on the edge of my life. The choice is clear. I can retreat to the familiar solitude, or I can step into this terrifying, beautiful unknown. I look at this man, this solid, steady man who saw me when I felt invisible. I see the vulnerability in his eyes, the risk he is taking by laying his heart bare. He is not offering to save me. He is offering to stand with me. He is offering me a partnership. The silence stretches. The only sound is the ticking of a clock on the wall, marking the seconds of my old life falling away. I take a breath. "Okay," I say. It's the same word I'd used in the barn, but this time it doesn't feel small. It feels huge. It feels like the beginning of everything. "Okay, Arthur," the relief that washes over his face is a beautiful thing to see. It's like the sun breaking through after a long storm. He reaches across the table, his hand covering mine. His touch is warm and firm, a silent promise. The weight of his hand is an anchor, not a chain. It is the steady warmth I have been searching for my entire life. We finished the church roof together. Not in the literal sense. I was still the one on the slate, doing the work that was mine. But Arthur was there. He wasn't just an observer anymore. He was a partner. He'd be there at the base of the ladder every morning, a thermos of coffee in hand. He'd help me hoist materials, his quiet strength making the work easier, faster. He'd stay late, helping me clean the site, our movements falling into an easy, unspoken rhythm. The town noticed, of course. Havenwood was too small for anything to go unseen. I saw the looks from Mrs. Gable at the post office, the way the men at the feed store would fall silent when Arthur and I walked in together. There were whispers, I was sure, but Arthur seemed oblivious, or perhaps he simply didn't care. He moved through the town with the same quiet confidence he always had, his hand sometimes resting on the small of my back as we went through a doorway, a small, proprietary gesture that was both a comfort and a thrill. He was, in his understated way, claiming me, and I was letting him. One afternoon, we were working on the final, most difficult part of the job, the very peak of the steeple, where a new copper cross needed to be installed. It was a dizzying height, the ground a distant, abstract pattern below. I was secured by a safety harness, but the wind was sharp, tugging at me, trying to unbalance me. Arthur stood on the main roof below, one hand on the ladder, his eyes fixed on me. His face was a mask of concentration, his worry a palpable thing I could feel even from 30 feet away. "Be careful, Leo," he called up, his voice tight. I looked down at him, at this strong, capable man who was, for some reason, terrified for my safety. A wave of affection, so powerful it almost knocked the air from my lungs, washed over me. I wanted to tell him that I had never felt safer in my life. "It's almost done," I called back, my voice steady. I settled the cross into its mounting, my hands sure and practiced. As I tightened the final bolt, I felt a sense of completion that went far beyond finishing a job. I had not just repaired a roof. I had rebuilt my life. When I climbed down, my legs shaky from the height and the adrenaline, he was waiting for me. He didn't say anything. He just reached out and pulled me into his arms. It wasn't a tentative embrace. It was a solid, grounding hug, his arms wrapped tightly around me, my face pressed against the rough fabric of his jacket. I could feel the steady, reassuring beat of his heart against my ear. I wrapped my own arms around his broad back, holding on just as tightly. "It's done," I whispered into his shoulder. "You're done," he corrected me, his voice rough with emotion. "No more steeples," he pulled back just enough to look at me, his hands still resting on my shoulders. His eyes were searching mine, and I saw in them a question he didn't dare ask. The unspoken tension that had been simmering between us for weeks was suddenly at a boiling point. The job was finished. The buffer of our professional relationship was gone. Now it was just us, Leo and Arthur, two men standing in the shadow of a small-town church, with a future that was waiting to be decided. He took a half-step back, his hands dropping from my shoulders, as if he was afraid he had crossed a line. He was giving me an out, an opportunity to walk away, to pretend this was just about a job. But I was tired of walking away. I reached out and took his hand. His skin was rough, calloused, but his grip, when he closed his hand around mine, was gentle. "Let's go home," I said. The word hung in the air between us. Home. Not his home. Not my rented room. Just home. A slow smile spread across his face. A smile of pure, unadulterated joy. "Yeah," he said, his voice thick. "Let's go home." He didn't let go of my hand as we walked to his truck. It was a simple, public declaration. It was an answer to the whispers. It was a beginning. The foreman's cottage was a wreck, but it was a beautiful wreck. It had good bones, solid stone walls, a decent roof I had already mentally assessed, and a small porch that looked out over a rolling pasture where a handful of horses grazed peacefully. It had been neglected for years, but I could see what it could be. I could see a home. We stood on the porch, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the valley. Arthur was quiet beside me, his hands in his pockets, giving me space to take it all in. "It's a lot of work," he said finally. "I'm good with my hands," I replied, a small smile playing on my lips. He turned to me, his expression serious. "Leo, about the job. I want to be clear. This is yours. Your project. Your salary is non-negotiable, and it will be deposited into your account every Friday, whether you're working on this cottage or something else. Your independence is important." To me, he was, once again, carefully dismantling the power dynamic, ensuring I felt like an equal, not an employee who was also his. What? What were we? The question hung in the air, unspoken but urgent. "Arthur," I said, turning to face him fully. "I know. I trust you." The simple declaration seemed to hit him with the force of a physical blow. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a raw, unguarded emotion. He took a step closer, until we were standing toe-to-toe. The air was thick with the scent of hay and dry grass and the clean, masculine scent that was uniquely his. He raised a hand, his movements slow, hesitant, as if he was afraid I might bolt. He gently cupped my jaw, his thumb stroking the rough stubble on my cheek. His touch was electric, a jolt of warmth that spread through my entire body. I leaned into his hand, my eyes fluttering shut for a moment. "I've wanted to do this," he whispered, his voice a low rumble. "Since the first day I saw you up on that roof. Looking like you were holding up the sky all by yourself, my heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. This is it. The moment of truth. The culmination of weeks of stolen glances, quiet conversations, and unspoken longing." I opened my eyes and looked at him. There was no doubt in his gaze, no hesitation. Only a deep, abiding affection that was so profound it made my throat ache. "What are you waiting for?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. That was all the invitation he needed. He leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't a tentative, questioning kiss. It was a kiss of certainty, of arrival. His lips were firm and warm, moving against mine with a slow, deliberate confidence that was both thrilling and deeply reassuring. It was a kiss that spoke of patience, of a desire that had been held in check for a long time. I melted into him, my hands coming up to grip his shirt. I kissed him back with all the pent-up loneliness and yearning I had carried for years. It was a release, a confession, a promise. It felt like coming home. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. His thumb continued its gentle stroking of my cheek. "Steady," he murmured, his breath warm against my lips. "Steady," I agreed, a smile spreading across my face. We stood there for a long time, on the porch of the broken-down cottage that would become our home, wrapped in each other's arms as the sun set over the valley. The world was quiet except for the sound of our breathing and the distant nicker of a horse. The foundation was set. The work was just beginning. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the climb. I had someone to climb with. The first weeks were a delicate dance of navigation. We were learning each other's rhythms, the quiet routines that had defined our separate lives for so long. There was an initial awkwardness, a brief period of uncertainty that settled in the morning after our first kiss. I woke up in his bed, the sheets smelling of him, and a cold wave of panic washed over me. The reality of our situation, the sheer improbability of it, hit me with full force. What had I done? Who was I to be here, in this man's life, in his home? I slipped out of bed and went to the kitchen, my mind racing with all the old insecurities. I was halfway through making a pot of coffee when he came in, his hair rumpled from sleep, wearing a soft gray t-shirt that stretched across his broad chest. He stopped in the doorway, his expression unreadable. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought I saw regret in his eyes. I thought he was going to say this was all a mistake. "You're up early," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Couldn't sleep," I mumbled, my eyes fixed on the coffee maker. He walked over to the counter and stood beside me, not touching, but his presence was a warm, solid weight. He was silent for a long moment, and I could feel him studying me. "Are you all right, Leo?" he asked, his voice gentle. I took a shaky breath. Honesty. That was what we had to build this on. "I'm scared," I admitted, the words feeling small and inadequate. "This is a lot. You're a lot. I'm not used to this." He didn't try to dismiss my fears. He didn't say, "Don't be scared." He just nodded, a slow, understanding gesture. "I know," he said. "It's a lot for me, too." He finally reached out, not to touch me, but to take the coffee pot and pour 2 mugs. He handed one to me. "So we take it slow," he said simply. "One day at a time. No expectations. We just are." His quiet reassurance was exactly what I needed. He wasn't making grand promises or declarations of love. He was offering me something far more valuable: patience. He was acknowledging my fear and giving me the space to move through it at my own pace. He understood that for a man who had spent his life in precarious positions, solid ground could feel just as frightening as a long fall. We established a routine. I would spend my days at the cottage, working on the restoration. It was my space, my project. I drew up the plans, I ordered the materials, I did the work. Arthur would check in, bringing me lunch or a cold drink, but he never interfered. He respected my expertise, my ownership of the project. He was my patron, my partner, but he was not my boss. It was a crucial distinction, one he was careful to maintain. Evenings we would spend together. Sometimes we'd cook dinner in his kitchen, the easy camaraderie we'd found in the barn blossoming in this new domestic space. Other times we'd just sit on the porch of the main house, watching the stars come out, not needing to fill the silence with words. We were learning the art of being together, of sharing a space without encroaching on each other's solitude. The town's reaction was a minor test. One day, at the hardware store, Frank Miller, a man known more for his opinions than his tact, cornered me by the lumber aisle. "So," he said, a sly grin on his face. "Heard you're living out at the Vance place now. Quite the step up from that room of yours." The implication was clear, the insinuation of me being a gold digger hanging in the air. My face flushed with anger and shame. Before I could stammer out a defense, a calm, steady voice came from behind me. "Leo is overseeing the restoration of the old cottage," Arthur said. He had come up behind me, so quietly I hadn't heard him. He placed a hand on my shoulder, a simple gesture of solidarity. I'm lucky to have him. It's hard to find a craftsman with his skill. He looked directly at Frank, his gaze level and unwavering. "Isn't that right, Frank?" Frank Miller, faced with the quiet authority of Arthur Vance, suddenly found his shoes fascinating. Yeah? Sure, Arthur." Just making conversation, he scurried away, his retreat a small victory. Arthur didn't remove his hand from my shoulder. He gave it a gentle squeeze. "Don't let them get to you," he said, his voice low, for my ears only. "Their opinions don't matter. What we have is ours." In that moment, standing in the dusty aisle of the hardware store, I felt a fierce surge of love for this man. He hadn't made a scene. He hadn't been aggressive. He had simply stood with me, defended my honor, and claimed our connection with a quiet dignity that silenced all gossip. He had protected me, not by fighting my battles for me, but by standing beside me so I didn't have to fight them alone. That night, as we lay in bed, the moonlight streaming through the window, I turned to him. "Thank you," I said, "for today." At the store, he turned on his side to face me, propping his head up on his hand. "There's nothing to thank me for," he said. "I'm proud to be with you, Leo. I want people to know that." I reached out and traced the lines on his face, the map of a life well lived. "I'm not used to it," I admitted. "Someone having my back, get used to it," he said, his voice a soft rumble. He leaned in and kissed me, a slow, tender kiss that was full of reassurance and promise. It was a kiss that said, "You are not alone anymore." The work on the cottage progressed. Walls were framed, windows were replaced, floors were sanded and refinished. With every nail I hammered, every board I cut, I felt like I was not just building a house, but building a life. The physical act of creation was healing, grounding. It was tangible proof that I could make something beautiful and lasting. Arthur and I found our rhythm. Our physical intimacy was like everything else between us. Unhurried, patient, a slow exploration of trust and desire. It was less about passion and more about connection, about the profound comfort of holding and being held. It was the quiet intimacy of waking up in his arms, the simple pleasure of his hand finding mine as we watched a movie, the steady warmth of his body next to mine in the dark. One Saturday, we spent the entire day working on the cottage's porch together. We replaced the rotten floorboards, our movements synchronized, our banter easy and light. It was hard work, but it felt like play. At the end of the day, we sat on the newly finished porch, exhausted but satisfied, drinking cold beers as the sun went down. "It's looking like a home," Arthur said, his eyes scanning our handiwork. "It's getting there," I agreed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to me, his expression serious. "I was thinking," he said, "when it's done, I'd like to move in here. With you." The offer stunned me into silence. The main house was his family home, the seat of his legacy. For him to offer to leave it, to move into this small, restored cottage with me. It was a profound statement. It was him, once again, leveling the playing field, choosing to meet me in the middle, in a space that we had built together. "Are you serious?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I've never been more serious," he said. "That big house is full of ghosts, Leo. It's my past. This," he gestured to the cottage, to the valley spread out before us. "This feels like our future." Tears pricked my eyes. I had spent so much of my life feeling transient, temporary. He was offering me a forever. He was offering to build a new legacy with me. "Okay," I said, the word thick with emotion. "Okay, Arthur," he smiled, that slow, beautiful smile that still made my heart ache. He leaned over and kissed me, his lips tasting of beer and salt and home. Months passed. The cottage was finished. It was beautiful, filled with light and the scent of fresh paint and new wood. We moved in on the first day of spring, our belongings mingling together, creating something new that was uniquely ours. That first morning, I woke up in our bed, in our home, and watched the sunrise paint the valley in shades of pink and gold. Arthur was still asleep beside me, his breathing deep and even. I slipped out of bed and went to the kitchen, the new wooden floors cool beneath my feet. I made coffee, the familiar ritual now a cornerstone of our shared life. I took my mug out to the porch and sat in one of the rocking chairs we had built together. The air was cool and crisp, filled with the promise of a new day, a new season. I thought about the man I was a year ago, alone on that church roof, my world small and circumscribed by fear and loneliness. It felt like a different lifetime, a different person. Arthur had not saved me. I had saved myself. But he had given me the one thing I never knew I needed, a steady place to stand. He had seen my worth when I couldn't see it myself. He had respected my independence while offering his support. He had shown me that love wasn't about possession or control. It was about partnership, about two people choosing to build something together, board by board. The screen door creaked open and he came out, another mug in his hand. He sat down in the rocker next to me, his shoulder brushing against mine. He didn't speak, just sat with me in companionable silence, watching the sun climb higher in the sky. The difference in our ages, in our wealth, in our histories, it hadn't disappeared. It was still a part of our story, but it was no longer a barrier. It was just context. The foundation of our relationship wasn't built on his money or my skill. It was built on mutual respect, on quiet care, on the conscious choice, made every single day, to love and honor the man beside you. He reached over and took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. His grip was warm, familiar, strong. It felt like coming home. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice a low rumble in the morning quiet. I looked at our joined hands, then at his face, softened by the morning light. I smiled. "Just thinking," I said, "that I've never had a better view, and I wasn't talking about the sunrise." Share your thoughts in the comments. What moment stayed with you? If the story resonated, a like helps others find it. Subscribe for more slow burn male/male love stories told with warmth and care.